Welcome to the All Ambient podcast, where we dig into the creative process, hear untold stories, and explore the brilliant minds behind some of the finest ambient music out there. I'm your host, Mike Graff. I'm excited to be in this together with you. Let's get going. Here we are, friends, another music news episode of the All Ambient podcast. We dug into some interesting stuff today. We are here to talk about AI machine learning data sets. There's a lot going on in this field across not just the music industry, but all industries. And what is being fed to these learning AI algorithms that then in response will generate content based on those responses. It's going to be a really interesting subject to keep track of across all avenues of life that this impacts. But of course, we're talking specifically about the music world, and it brought up some very interesting points. Really enjoyed it. Let's not wait any longer. Let's get right into this week's music news. Welcome to another music news edition of the All Ambient podcast. I am joined by Kirk, Ben, and Marshall. Guys, it is good to see you.
Hey, Mike.
Hello, friends.
Great to see you guys.
Good to see you guys too.
Here we go. So a little bit of news in the world today. So music news is kind of a broad umbrella, right? There is a lot that's happening in the music industry, recorded music, licensing music, live music, a lot of things. So this particular bit that we're going to talk about today maybe has less of, at time of recording, that there's not necessarily something that's spreading through the national, international airwaves on news sites or anything, but there was kind of an interesting thing that happened with all the members of the people sitting around this virtual table. And we all were sent a message from a particular licensing site, music licensing site, that said, hey, we're moving in a new direction and we are giving you the opportunity to consent or decline. So even if this is not a conversation across every single person who's paying attention to music news, it certainly is one that's happening to the people here. And it is one that just more and more that we're hearing people talk about throughout, and just kind of the general idea, not just how this has implications to each of us personally, but kind of how this has implications across the entire industry. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting topic to dig into. So what that topic is, in fact, for anyone who's listening to the podcast, they've already seen the title, but the title is Machine Learning Dataset, AI Machine Learning Dataset. Yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's,
yep.
I mean, that's
okay, cool.
That's most of the words probably in the right order.
Oh, man. I might not even edit that out. I'll just scan and just keep that in. Who knows? That's funny. But what we're talking about, there's a lot of words and syllables attached to it, but ultimately it comes down to AI machine learning data sets. I don't want to talk too much about it because I honestly feel like I probably know the least about this in the circle of people here. But ultimately, the long and short of it is that permission is being asked for us to feed our music to an AI algorithm so we can learn how to make music like us. And yeah, that's ultimately what all of us have been asked. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think
well,
so.
why don't somebody expound on this in much more eloquent ways than I am capable of coming up with right now? What's happening at this moment?
As someone who knows maybe just slightly more, because I literally did a Google search like as you were talking. Let me go first so I sound at least smarter than you, and then we'll go from there.
It doesn't take much, dude. You're
But literally, I mean, it's like what I put in was, what is a data set, right? And this is what AI Overview told me. It says a data set is a collection of data used to train and test machine learning algorithms and models. What is a data set? It is a set of data. When we're talking about like, okay, there's all these words and all this kind of stuff, it's like, I think that's largely what this is. It's kind of like a redefinition of words to create something with an appearance of that's something different. But I think if we translate it as like a data set is what we would call musical works, like usually in contracts, you hear this term musical works, and that is the actual sound recording and or the composition itself. And you hear that thrown around. And when you see that, you're like, okay, I better pay attention to the lines that are around that phrase, musical works. Well, now it's like being replaced with the phrase data set, which sounds kind of like safe or like, it's like, oh, it's just, just like data set, like, ones and zeros or whatever. It's like,
Right.
But it's like, I think basically from my understanding, it means musical works for the purpose of training the machine. So it's like feed your musical works to the machine so the machine can regurgitate musical works from the things that it's learned from you.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And in this very specific case, because I do have the memo that was sent round on the screen, it also contains the keywords and title and other metadata which is associated with the musical work. So, if We Dream of Eden or whatever is associated with that work, then that will also be fed to the beast.
Yeah. And what I've noticed, and I did a little bit of like tiny research, it's like, I don't want to pick on like this one group or whatever, because what I'm noticing is that it's becoming an overarching thing to where it's like, if people have libraries, they're basically being approached by all these other companies saying, hey, we have this thing, we need your things, let's do something together, and so it's not just one company doing something, but it's like, if it's a library that owns material, it's going to be approached by people with machine learning apps that they're trying to develop because they realize they have to get as much data in their set to make what they're trying to make.
And there was such a backlash against the companies like Suno and Udio and many others who used unlicensed music. They just scraped Spotify or whatever they did. I'm not exactly sure how it worked, but they used a whole bunch of stuff they didn't have the rights to. Whereas here, they're
at least trying to do due diligence. Yeah.
They're doing it essentially perfectly legally, and we're opting in to potentially use our music in this context, which I don't know. I don't know if we want to jump the gun here and kind of lay our cards on the table, but from my perspective, it's
show of hands. How many people in this room are saying, I am not going to opt in to and we can maybe change our mind by the end of this whole discussion, but as of right now, how many of you by show of hands will be opting out of the opportunity to feed our musical works as part of the data set?
My initial reaction is hands up. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
You didn't do it. The rest of us did it, Kirk.
No, I know, because it's still one of those things to where it's like, it's going to happen and they're going to get it one way or the other. So I can either
not to cut you
wave
off
my
at
fist.
All, but
yeah,
I want to hear more, but just this, like everything that we're about to discuss is not a drag on even the particular licensing company that sent this to us by any means. That's not the conversation at all. Super grateful for that company, for all the companies and all the different entities that we get to partner with and get to do this together. Like, that's an incredible thing. This is certainly a bigger discussion. It has implications across the entire industry, across the whole world.
Sure.
It's not just as well. So I just wanted to make sure, Claire. Yeah. So as there's maybe a little fear and trepidation in like, I don't want to, like, it's not a critique or a slam on any company or any of that stuff. It's more so what's actually being asked. So, okay, continue though, please. Disclaimer's done. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think the initial idea would be like, I would have to see proof of concept.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
To like, how is this actually going down? Like what we were talking about earlier, it's like how many billions, like millions, hundreds of millions of songs in order to actually create a product that is of integrity, as opposed to scraping everything and then like, oh yeah, that bass line is definitely from this other song because they didn't give it enough funk records to make it its own thing. So it's like you need a large language model to have something that has the semblance of originality. So, and so that at that point, you're talking about hundreds of millions of contributors, and a licensed track that makes $1 is now split into 100 million pieces. How does that work in a way that's sustainable? I get it.
And I know, Ben, for sure, there's been another company who's reached out. I've had, I think, 2 emails like with a similar situation. And I would assume it's probably in the same case with this one where it's like, yes, you can opt in the future if you want. Do you want to opt in now? Or you can also opt in later. I don't know if that offers any I'm not going to say it offers me any motivation on like a decision right now, but I guess to that point, it maybe gives you a little chance to see like, well, how does this actually like play out as far as once this is implemented and a part of our, how we do business and everything, what does that actually look like? Because I think that's more probably what a lot of us are wondering. It's like, I don't know, for me, I'm confused as to how does this what does this do to your library? What does this do to our music? There's really no like discussion of any of that, or I can't really seem to wrap my head around that. It's just kind of like, can we just use your music? And then for me, I'm just kind of like, well, what does that actually mean moving forward when that starts being kind of like a regular thing? I'm just kind of, I'm curious about that particularly, because it just seems the discussion is more, can we have your music so that it can learn how to do this? And then I just don't know what that's going to look like down the road.
Right.
Well, the implication, right, is what is being created here, not just this company who we're talking about is part of a larger thing here where they're trying to essentially create a fully licensed, massive AI generative tool that has, fully licensed music, which is presumably anyone can go in there, pay some money to this company and generate music, which they are then able to use in quite possibly adding it to Spotify, adding it, licensing it themselves and all those kind of things. Yes, maybe there will be a tiny bit of money which trickles back down to us in some way, shape or form. But to me, that feels quite counterproductive for ourselves. Like we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot as artists. And I know it's very inconsequential, the 20 tracks that I have with this company, like that is not going to make a big difference. So I completely take that point. But to opt into these kind of things, we're basically saying as a kind of artist pool that we're okay with basically like allowing our music to be used and then created into something else, probably replacing a lot of the smaller scale licensing that we do for far, far less money than we would be getting if we were just licensing the individual tracks that we own directly. And so, I don't know, I just don't really like this direction. And kind of, I guess on principle, I'm kind of like leaning towards opting out, even though I'm fully aware that me opting out is inconsequential in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. We're not going to stop AI, right? It's not like if the four of us, form a coalition and we're like, we're not going to do it. Well, yeah, that's great. There's going to be 700,000 other artists that are, that's not the talk here. I see it from two different ways, or at least two different points. Point number one is I don't love the quantity instead of quality conversation. Like, who is to say, and again, it's all subjective, right? Art is subjective, but who is to say that if somebody who has a ton of music on some licensing platform that they were able to get their stuff on, but it's not necessarily, say, the highest caliber, I guess would be one way to put it, versus somebody else who has put a lot of time and a lot of work into their songs, but maybe has 10% of the number of tracks. Like, let's just pretend. It is interesting to me that it just seems like on the surface that this is in no way is this data set saying, hey, there's some real influence in the artist that spent a lot of time and has a smaller catalog. And maybe that smaller catalog has done really well, has gotten some momentum and is being licensed by a lot of people or being streamed by a lot of people. It has shown itself to be a thing of quality. I am curious if the data set, if the machine that is learning that data set, if it is smart enough to pull some of those factors into the equation that, oh, hey, this one has seen some traction versus this other one that really hasn't seen much of anything, but they did opt in. So it is now part of the data set. I think I have not confusion there, but I think that'll be one of the interesting things that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because I could line up 400 different canvases around my house, like 24 by 36 canvas, and I could flick paint on all of them and just run laps around the house and like technically make 400 canvas paintings and like, hey, and this is going out to the world, and hey, that can be studied as a point of data in whatever set, versus like I'm actually staring at a painting over in a corner of my studio that my friend Courtney did in kind of a unique, we'll talk more about it later. I'm not trying to go on a tangent, but it was a Dear Gravity thing. She was listening to a Dear Gravity EP and hadn't heard it, and then just kind of painted this on the spot while she was doing that. And we shot the video, and we're going to release it. It's going to be really cool. But the one painting in the corner by Courtney is easily cooler than the 400 paintings that I would be stacking up in my garage after running laps around my house. But is the machine that's studying the data set smart enough to know that Courtney's one entry is a much more valid entry than my 400? Maybe they turn out cool, who knows, but certainly not to the degree of someone who knows what they're doing. So I think that's one thing that's kind of tripping up my head a little bit. I'm not smart enough to know any more about kind of the ins and outs of all that. Does anyone have any insight on, are there different levers, or is it almost like a character ranking on some sort of game where it's like hit points, this and attack? Like, do data points get different degrees of
Strength.
validity? I don't know. What does that look like? Anybody got any thoughts? Any ideas on that?
The only idea I have is that I imagine if these AI companies are like labels, then these music libraries are like A&R, and they're trusting these libraries to be the A&R for their label. And so
Sure.
rather than just opening up the floodgates and letting everything in, they're at least trying to go to trusted sources of content.
Yeah.
Their product, in the end, their product will only be as good as what they teach it. And so maybe they're trying to have some type of quality control over what gets into the machine so that it doesn't, go south. That's the only thing that I can imagine.
So it's less about,
you are what you eat.
Right. It's more about doing the gatekeeping before it gets into the data set than it is about what happens priority wise once it's in the data set. Maybe all the data points are equal once they're in, but the gatekeeper is pretty important. The A&R, like you said, the one who's allowing something to pass or to not pass.
I think so. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. And then you figure out how to build your like filters and parameters and what you label it and what you do, based off of, I guess, understanding the different genres and how people talk about them.
Yeah.
Ben, you'd probably know this as I mean, what that makes me think of isn't that it sounds similar, Kirk, to like how music is pitched now, like editorially through, I don't know whether it's through Spotify or through all of them, or if that's actually accurate. But I know I've heard the conversation of like that music and what's being pitched. I mean, of course, the amount of music that's on Spotify has to go through some kind of funnel because, whoever's approving those onto the playlist is not actually listening to every single track, right? So I feel like maybe there's some similarity there with like parameters around how that's being kind of the initial intake, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and the only thing I was going to add was I think there's very likely, given that it is a kind of machine learning thing, that once it's live, it will itself learn from people's responses to the music it generates. So if it uses a whole bunch of data, in inverted commas, that then people are like, hey, I don't like this, create something different. I imagine that will be part of its kind of learning process. And it's like, hey, these tracks don't give the result that is desired. These ones do. And it kind of prioritizes. Now, whether that then filters back into the individual artists who created the better quality music up front, I have no idea. But I do imagine there will, quality probably will ultimately kind of filter through as people respond to the music it's creating.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
I think the other part of this whole question that I don't think any of us are inherently worried about, but it is certainly a factor, is how this plays out revenue-wise. And I think, the reason that it's kind of an unknown is that if this was the sort of thing where someone approached you, Marshall, and said, hey, you've got 100 tracks on a service. Great. We're willing to pay you. And I'm just making up numbers because unless this pans out the way that in some sort of crazy miracle way, this is not going to be the way it is. But if it were to be the sort of thing where, hey, Marshall, you got 100 tracks. And right now, we're willing to, if you want to feed that into our data set, like we're willing to pay you 10 grand a track to do it. So we will lump sum you $1 million US and you get to be part of the data set. We're really grateful for it. Like that would probably be a different conversation than, hey, can you put your music into this data set and you might see something from it. If you're like, we don't really know how it's all going to pan out, but you might see some revenue. I think that, and again, it was kind of exaggerative to make a point, but I think at some point we need to acknowledge that AI generated music is going to be a thing. It's going to be fed data set points from a bunch of different artists that are great. There will be great artists that say yes to this, maybe not just anything that is so, but there will be a lot of great artists who say yes to this for sure. I think at some point we need just to acknowledge that it's going to happen and that it's really more of a question. To me, it feels like more of a question of, do I, like, just as a matter of principle, like, do I want to keep creating music as Dear Gravity knowing that I have also fed an AI system a whole bunch of stuff as Dear Gravity so that it is pumping out songs that sound an awful lot like Dear Gravity. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's, and not in the sense of I don't want people to have access to that sort of thing, but more so like I really get excited about the things that I create. And I think, and not, I think all of us around this room could say the same thing, is that we've been doing this long enough where you kind of have a unique voice in the space. Like you're kind of saying something musically in a unique way that is still very much part of a genre, of course, but that feels kind of signature. Like you have the ability to make your mark in a way that's like, oh, that feels like Antarctic Wastelands, or oh, that feels like We Dream of Eden. And that's not a slam. That's not a, like you're pigeonholing yourself into a sound or you're fencing yourself into a sound. More so like you've developed a voice. And I think that's really cool. I guess the real question is, do you want that voice to also be a voice that gets artificially replicated and, you know, continues to be a part of these generated songs in addition to the art that you are currently creating? And my gut says no on that. I would like to keep my own voice, but that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be great stuff that's generated. I just think that I want to keep painting over in my corner, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah, just 2 cents.
Mm-hmm.
It's good.
Is that perspective, is that something that, I mean, I'm sure you guys, maybe I'm assuming that you guys would perhaps agree with me on, but like, what are we overlooking? Is there something, am I missing stuff on this? Because I don't think the entire answer is, well, this is going to be a bummer, so say no. Let's just keep dialoguing on it for a second, because I don't know if we're at the edge of this conversation yet. I feel like you guys have, I'm watching the eyes bounce around in your heads. There's more thoughts that have yet to spill out.
Yeah, one thing I was just kind of add to what you were saying, Mike, which is it's a question of kind of inspiration. So these AI generative models, they are in some way analogous to kind of being inspired by people's music. So I'll give an example. So, you know, I am inspired by so much music when I write myself, and I've been inspired by each one of you. And I'm sure there are elements of your music making that has made its way into my tracks over time, be it a specific sound, maybe even a chord progression, maybe there's just a feel, something of that has come through. But it's been filtered. Ben. Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. Like I saw a TED talk one time called "Everything Is a Remix." I'm not sure if you've come across that. But I truly believe that, you know, you are a product of your, you know, influences and the things you've heard when you write music. But when I'm writing music, I'm not taking the raw files of someone else's stuff and basically like taking parts out of it and then mashing it together into something new. It's kind of filtered through all of my experiences of life and where I am, what I'm hearing in different contexts and more, and emotion and everything. Whereas an AI model is purely taking audio files and data and metadata and all of that stuff and just churning stuff out. So because I've seen this comparison made of like, oh, it's just kind of like it's taking inspiration like any artist would. It's just taking inspiration from other people's music. And I feel like I guess I want to say that I feel like it's not. Like I feel there is a difference there, that it's taking more than that. It is taking, and it's not adding, or it's not that it's taking more than that. It is not adding anything of its own personal. There's no personality there. There's no soul, there's no life experience, there's no emotion. It is purely taking those data points. And yeah, I think that's what's missing there for me. It's like I'm not against, you know, I would not be against saying, hey, I opt in my music to be inspiring a particular artist. In fact, that would be amazing. You know, if there was a different kind of context and like, you know, 100 people opt in their music and then this artist creates something like inspired by them. Awesome. That's amazing. But that's not what this is.
Yeah.
But then kind of from that, I think there is an important question is of, right, this is going to happen. This whole AI system will exist, and many of them as well. What is our response as artists? Setting aside whether we opt in or not, what is our response as artists? And I do think for me personally, it is encouragement and even more of a drive to create unique, interesting music and also a community around that music, people who care about it. to set myself and ourselves aside from that, set ourselves away from things which feel like potentially relatively generic, to something that is really special, which really has that voice you're talking about, Mike. And yeah, that's kind of where it takes me. It's like, okay, no, I need to really like focus in on my craft, on what I'm doing that sets it apart from the generic stuff that's going to be churned out by these kind of models.
I think that's the best kind of reaction you can have to that, because I think we can either go into utter despair of what's the point. These guys are going to like more stuff than we could ever possibly make. In a day, they're going to make 20 albums worth of material, these machines. There's no competition from us purely, just content. But it's like, you know what? I love this. I love doing this. It brings me life. And I love the idea that these emotions that I can express through sound bring other people life. It's like, well, dang, then I'm going to lean into that and try to make the most emotional, inspiring thing that I can. And, it might take me 2 days to make 3 minutes, but you know what? It's important. So yeah, that's great. I think that's the best kind of reaction we can have to this stuff. If the option is like despair and quitting versus getting more emotional and more intentionally unique and realizing that the emotion can translate, and it does translate to the listener,
Wow. Love that. We better end right there. I love you guys. I know this won't be the last time we talk about it. It's not the first time we've talked about AI, but this is an interesting point where it's not just talking about AI generative music, but about our particular involvement along with countless, other amazing artists and musicians that, is what we do going to be a part of the very data that generates the music. Won't be the last time we talk about it, but I think we're at a really healthy place. It's good to look at the reality of it, but also really echoing a lot of what you guys said, to do it in a way that isn't disheartening, but rather is inspiring and asking us to say, okay, what now? And what is the real focus of all this? So it's so healthy. Love it. Man, appreciate you guys. You're the best. Thanks for weighing in. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Mike.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the All Ambient podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can catch every conversation we have with all these incredible people who share the same passion. I'm looking forward to the next time, and I hope you are too. Can't wait to see you then, and until then, have an incredible day. Here's hoping this music and the heart behind it makes your day and life that much better. We'll see you next time.